Hey guys, so today we're going to be going over the second part of our respiratory system lesson by talking about internal respiration. So internal respiration is all about how gases get essentially from your tissues into your capillaries or vice versa. So we're going to be going over what partial pressure is and how it helps carbon dioxide and oxygen diffuse through your body. We're going to talk about how oxygen is carried through the blood, as well as how internal respiration works and how carbon dioxide is transported through the blood. We'll briefly touch on how your blood pH is maintained, as well as how carbon dioxide and oxygen levels are maintained in the body. So the partial pressure of a gas is just the pressure that a gas exerts. And when you're looking at the partial pressure of a gas, you're only looking at one gas at a time. Gases will always move from high partial pressure to low partial pressure. So carbon dioxide and oxygen both exert completely different partial pressures in different parts of the body. Oxygen partial pressure is always highest in the atmosphere, while carbon dioxide partial pressure is always lowest in the atmosphere. So with oxygen partial pressure, it's highest in the atmosphere. It drops down a bit as we get into the trachea, then it's much lower as we move into the arteries and then the tissues. Your oxygen partial pressure will always be super low in the tissues because oxygen is constantly being used up through the process of cellular respiration. So it just doesn't have a chance to build up in the tissues. Your veins will also have a really low partial pressure of oxygen because the blood in your veins is for the most part deoxygenated. And so all of the diffusion of oxygen from your alveoli into your capillaries and then from your capillaries into your actual tissues is all driven by oxygen just moving from higher partial pressure areas to lower partial pressure areas. Carbon dioxide kind of just works the opposite way. Carbon dioxide partial pressure is always highest in the tissues because carbon dioxide is constantly being produced as a waste product of cellular respiration. It's then going to be a little bit lower in the veins, and then lower still in the alveoli, and as we said, lowest in the atmosphere. So again, the diffusion of carbon dioxide from your tissues into your veins, into your capillaries, into the alveoli, and then eventually into the atmosphere is all just driven by carbon dioxide moving from areas of high partial pressure to low partial pressure. And that's just summarized in this chart here. So for oxygen, highest partial pressure is in the atmosphere, then the trachea, then the alveoli of the lungs, the arteries, and then the tissues where the oxygen actually ends up and gets used. And then of course it's also very low in the veins because the blood is deoxygenated. For carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is highest in the tissues. That causes the carbon dioxide to diffuse into the veins. Once it gets to the lungs, it'll diffuse into the alveoli because that has a lower partial pressure. From there, it'll diffuse up through the respiratory system until we get to the trachea, and then eventually completely out of the body into the atmosphere. So oxygen is always going to move from high partial pressure to lower partial pressure as it moves from the atmosphere down through the respiratory system and into the alveoli. It'll then diffuse into the capillary bed that surrounds the alveoli, and then into the pulmonary artery. It'll be carried through the arteries to the arterioles to the capillaries, where it can then diffuse into the tissues. When oxygen first diffuses from the alveoli into the capillaries, it initially just dissolves into the plasma of your blood. However, very quickly, the iron, which is at the center of those heme groups, which is, there's like 4 of them for every hemoglobin, and your red blood cells have millions of hemoglobin. So all of those ions of the heme groups are going to bind to the oxygen, which allows your red blood cells to carry way more oxygen than just the plasma could dissolve. So it dramatically increases the amount of oxygen that can be transported through your blood when your red blood cells bind the oxygen to those heme groups. Internal respiration just refers to the movement of oxygen from the blood into your tissues. So the oxygen is going to be carried by your red blood cells on that hemoglobin until it gets to the capillaries. Once the oxygenated blood reaches the capillaries, the oxygen is going to dissociate or unbind from the hemoglobin, and then the oxygen can diffuse from the capillaries into the tissue. Once again, that happens naturally because your tissues have a lower partial pressure of oxygen, because oxygen doesn't build up there, constantly being used up. Carbon dioxide transport is going to essentially move the opposite direction. We have the buildup of carbon dioxide in your tissues, and it's then going to dissolve into your capillaries. Now, a small amount of carbon dioxide will just directly dissolve into the plasma. A little over a quarter of it is going to bind as a full carbon dioxide molecule to your hemoglobin, but the majority of the carbon dioxide that moves from your tissues into your blood actually reacts with the water in your plasma to form carbonic acid. That's this reaction underneath here. So carbon dioxide plus water makes carbonic acid. And that is facilitated by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, which just increases the rate at which that reaction can happen so that more of the carbon dioxide that goes into your blood can be converted into carbonic acid. And the reason that's important is because your blood needs to maintain a lower partial pressure or a lower concentration of carbon dioxide than your tissues, so that carbon dioxide continues to diffuse from your tissues into your blood. If all of the carbon dioxide from your tissues diffused directly into your blood, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in your blood would be too high for that diffusion process to continue. But by most of that carbon dioxide getting converted into carbonic acid, it makes sure that carbon dioxide will continue to diffuse into your blood. That carbonic acid then obviously affects your blood pH. It's an acid, so it's going to lower your blood pH. And that happens because when the carbonic acid is in your blood, it naturally dissociates, like most acids do in solution, into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And it's those hydrogen ions, those H+ ions that are floating around, that lower your blood pH. So this is where your hemoglobin comes in to help regulate your blood pH. The hemoglobin is going to bind to those hydrogen ions so that those hydrogen ions are taken out of solution, which then brings your blood pH back to normal. And then the hemoglobin is going to carry those hydrogen ions all the way to the lungs. And then once the blood reaches the capillaries that are in your lungs, oxygen is going to diffuse from your alveoli into your blood. That oxygen molecule has a stronger attachment to the hemoglobin. So the oxygen molecule is going to come over, it's going to kick the hydrogen ion off of the hemoglobin and bind to the hemoglobin itself, at which point the hydrogen ion is now back in solution. It has just been ditched by the hemoglobin, who has run off with the oxygen. And so the hydrogen ion is going to re-bond with the bicarbonate ion that is still floating around in solution. Then that is going to form carbonic acid, which will then reform back into carbon dioxide and water. So it essentially just goes through the reverse process that it started off with when it first entered the blood. And that carbon dioxide is free to be diffused into the alveoli and then breathed out. So carbon dioxide in the pulmonary vein will go into that capillary bed and then diffuse into the alveoli, and then exhaled when the diaphragm relaxes and the intercostal muscles relax. Okay, when it comes to maintaining carbon dioxide levels, this is a job of the medulla oblongata in your brain. Essentially, anytime you exercise and your aerobic cellular respiration increases, that's going to also increase your carbon dioxide production. As your muscle cells are working more, they need more energy, so more ATP, which means more cellular respiration is happening, which means more of that carbon dioxide waste is being produced. That increase in carbon dioxide levels in the blood is going to be detected by chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata then sends a nerve signal to your intercostal muscles, causing them to contract, which then increases your breathing rate, so you breathe out that carbon dioxide more quickly, and then that drops your carbon dioxide back down to normal. Once your carbon dioxide levels are normal, they will stop stimulating those chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, so your intercostal muscles stop being stimulated and your breathing rate goes back to normal. So that's just an example of a negative feedback loop. Maintaining oxygen levels works similarly. Your oxygen levels are also detected by chemoreceptors, though these chemoreceptors are not in the medulla oblongata. They're in your carotid artery, which is the artery that brings oxygenated blood from your heart to your head. So inside that carotid artery, you have these chemoreceptors, which are called carotid bodies, and they detect the oxygen level in that blood as it goes up to your head. If that oxygen level drops, those receptors send a signal to the medulla oblongata. And then just like with the carbon dioxide regulation, the medulla oblongata sends a nerve signal to the intercostal muscles. Your intercostal muscles contract more, speeding up your breathing rate to move more oxygen into the body. Okay, so this is just kind of a summary of what's happening with the carbon dioxide transport. So we start with the carbon dioxide building up in the tissues as cellular respiration takes place. That carbon dioxide is then going to diffuse from higher partial pressure in the tissues to an area of lower partial pressures in your veins. Once in your veins, the carbon dioxide is going to react with the water in your blood to form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is then going to dissociate into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Then the hemoglobin in your blood is going to come along and it is going to bind with that hydrogen ion to form a hemoglobin holding a hydrogen ion. And that's going to be carried all the way to your lungs. Now, once it gets to the capillaries around your lung, you are going to have oxygen diffusing from the alveoli of the lungs into your blood. And that oxygen is going to come and it is going to head over to the hemoglobin attached to the hydrogen ion. It is going to kick the hydrogen ion off of the hemoglobin so that the oxygen can bind to the hemoglobin instead. And that hemoglobin holding the oxygen then goes back to your tissues of your body where that oxygen can be used. Meanwhile, that hydrogen ion that just got ditched is going to rebond to the bicarbonate ions from earlier. And then the bicarbonate ion is going to react with the hydrogen ion to eventually reform carbon dioxide and water. That carbon dioxide then diffuses into the alveoli of the lungs where it can then be breathed out. In terms of regulating carbon dioxide and oxygen levels, we start off with carbon dioxide. If carbon dioxide levels get too high, that is going to trigger the chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata then sends a nerve signal to the intercostal muscles, telling them to contract more, which increases the breathing rate, which then lowers the carbon dioxide levels. With oxygen, if the oxygen levels get too low, that is going to be detected by the carotid bodies, those chemoreceptors in the carotid artery, which send a nerve signal to the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata then sends a nerve signal to the intercostal muscles, telling them to contract more, which increases the breathing rate, which then increases the oxygen levels. Okay, please let me know if you have any questions about any of this stuff.